can say is that, and there are reasons for that. One of them is because, well, I'm not a very good public speaker, surprisingly. As a professor of philosophy, I should be better at these things. But the reason for that, there is a reason for that, and the reason is that I grew up in a political culture where the best rhetorical skill was trying to get out of speaking publicly, so as to avoid saying dangerous things and embarrassing yourself. And I had very good role models. My father was always sick whenever, he was supposed to give some kind of a public speech, and my uncle was always drunk, and he always avoided being called to the podium because he was never in a position to say anything. He died young, unfortunately. But Stalinist regimes were quite tolerant with drunks, and that's not the case with democracies. And since I'm driving, I couldn't get drunk to get out of this. So that's one reason. The other reason, there is a second reason. I've managed to come up with two reasons. There's another reason why I'm not very good at this, and that's because it takes me forever to find the right angle to evaluate the meaning of anything. And then when I find the right angle, I find nothing positive to say. And this is no exception. I have nothing positive to say. But since I'm a philosopher, and philosophers always speak the truth, well, here's the truth about World Philosophy Day. I had three things that I wanted to say, but I forgot one. So I'm a Hegelian, so it always comes in threes. Except that this time, I forgot one. And so I'll restrict myself to two. So I downloaded something from the internet yesterday. And now I know where Jeff Noonan got his inspiration for his wonderful speech last year. He talked about philosophy as reflection about reflection. And it's right here. So that was the only good thing that I found on that website. And I'll read the first sentence because it's really instructive. It says, it was originally written in French, I think, and then they had one of those professional translators at UNESCO who translated it into English. Many philosophers, many thinkers state that astonishment is the root of philosophy. I think that's the English for Thalmazein, wonder. Indeed, philosophy stems from humans' natural tendency to be astonished by themselves and the world in which they live. I have to subscribe to that. We have a wonderful capacity to be astonished by ourselves. And then, there is a sort of long list of things that philosophy is supposed to be about, so I just, put some of them. It's a discipline, or is a field that continually questions well-established truths, verifies hypotheses, and finds conclusions. It produces concepts, ideas, and analysis. And it's a basis for critical, independent, and creative thought. And so on. It goes on like this for a couple of extra paragraphs. And it's funny because, it could be about anything. Sociology, algebra, home economics, not necessarily philosophy. The only thing that is really philosophical about this is that it is reflection about reflection. And I could say a couple of things about reflection, but then, again, I had my class this morning at 8:30, so I'd rather not go through the pain of having to, go through the mood one more time today. Why is UNESCO doing something like that? Why are they coming up with the World Philosophy Day? And I have an explanation for this. And the reason, in my opinion, is that UNESCO is one of those, helpless institutions with a budget. And apparently it employs a philosopher, someone who wanted to become a philosopher and couldn't find a job. So he got, some kind of compensation in organizing these kind of events. But what's interesting about these institutions, first of all, they're supposed to do wonderful things, but they can't. Because, most of the time, the things that are worth fighting for are in countries that don't quite allow institutions like UNESCO. Just remember the statues of Buddha in Afghanistan that were destroyed, blown up by the Taliban about 15 years ago. They were on the UNESCO list of monuments. So I think this doesn't perhaps, speak too well of philosophy itself, so who knows what might happen. And if you look on their website, World Philosophy Day, you see a list of events that are supposed to take place today. Ours is not on that list, unfortunately. But there is a wonderful conference that is organized by the Russian Academy of the Sciences, the Institute of Philosophy of the Russian Academy of the Sciences in Paris, about the use of public philosophy. or the functions of public philosophy. Now imagine, the Russian Academy of the Sciences organizes a conference on public philosophy in Paris, presumably with Putin's money. That tells you something about some aspects of some sort of the philosophy day. So that was the first negative thing. I think I remember the second one, but it's taking too long. And so I'll skip to the third one, the one that I wanted to talk about in the very beginning. I'm not sure exactly if this is a day of celebration or one of commemoration. It's a festive day. But given the gloomy mood of philosophers, professional philosophers, and graduate students in recent years, it looks like it can't be a celebration. It has to be more like a sort of funny wake. So, so have a drink and enjoy the time, and feel sorry for the state of philosophy, and in the process read interesting papers that will prove me wrong. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Radu. It's just this is a lot of false starts. I mean, it's philosophy itself. It seems to be a lot of false starts, but I hate to do this because I forgot to mention a little bit earlier. We have a raffle. All right, raffle tickets are $2 each, or 3 for $5. Jennifer has my hat over there, and that will be from which we actually draw the raffle prizes. Carrara and the Department of the Journal of Informal Logic were good enough to donate a couple of bags, some old print-offs of the Journal of Informal Logic. Some Beverly is modeling them for us here. Some CDs of conference proceedings from various ASA conferences. Fog Lounge has donated 2 T-shirts, and Juniper Brooks has actually donated a $15 gift card for. Which I've got to say is one of the best used bookstores. I've had a lot of luck there in their philosophy department. It's on Ottawa Street over in Old Walkerville. It's basically an entire house. You just walk up in this house, you're in the kitchen, and you're shopping for books. You're in the living room and the bedrooms, you're shopping for books. It's wonderful. Right? So please, Jennifer will be coming around and asking you if you'd like to purchase some raffle tickets. And after the talks, we will do some raffles. Now, public philosophy. What we are... This is very strange, I've got to say. Okay, shall we wait for him? Okay, well, we will take a 3-minute break. Excuse me.
Juxtaposition, you and him.
No, but I could hear him, so I couldn't think of that.
He's still there.
Engineers work and
Okay. Well, since I'm the person introducing people, let me introduce myself. My name is Frank Yocum. I did my undergrad in philosophy from the University of Windsor. I did my master's in philosophy at Brock University in St. Catharines. And I'm actually a current PhD candidate in the Interdisciplinary Humanities program at Brock right now. Now, for about the past, it's got to be about 4 years, I've been sort of chairperson for this association. I've consistently been making an argument for what I've been loosely defining as public philosophy. Right? Now, just to give you an idea of why I think public philosophy is important, I thought it was important to take maybe 10 minutes. And like I say, make this silly little embarrassing argument, right? That starts off by getting you to think of how philosophers and the activity of philosophy is publicly perceived. Right? Now this, I have to admit, is a version of a talk I gave to the Philosophy Club at Brock University. And on my notes right here, I have a YouTube link to the Philosopher's World Cup from Monty Python. Right? I'm sure you recognize this reference, right? And the Philosopher's World Cup, and they're off. It's the Germans versus the Greeks, and for a long time nothing happened. Intermission, Nietzsche's black carded, they substitute Marx. He's going to add some step to the German team, and nothing happens. Right? It's the picture of the do-nothing philosopher. Right? It's pretty prevalent in our culture. The next YouTube link that I've got here is to Mel Brooks' History of the World Part 1. Never got a Part 2, but nonetheless. In Part 1, we get this fantastic scene of the stand-up philosopher standing in the unemployment line. Right? And what's the line? Right? He gets up to the front of the line, trying to apply for unemployment. Occupation, stand-up philosopher. Stand-up philosopher? Yeah, we try to coalesce the vapors of existence into a logically consistent and relatable whole. Response? Oh, you're bullshit. Have you bullshit this week? No. Have you tried to bullshit this week? Yes. So these are the public perceptions of philosophy. These are pretty prevalent, and as long as there have been philosophers, there have been derogatory jokes about them. Right? We think back to Thales. Right? Almost as soon as he had predicted the eclipse, there was the joke of him falling into the hole. Right? Wise Thales, his head up in the clouds, so far you can't see what's right at his feet. Right? We're lucky, in fact, if it's a good joke at our expense. Right? Now, in some cases, right, the tone of the public perception of philosophy is a little bit more serious. And it's, I want to start off by quoting from Stephen Hawking's new book, The Grand Design. The first salvo of the argument, you find humans are a curious species. We wonder, we seek answers. Living in this vast world that is, by turns, kind and cruel, and gazing at the immense heavens above, people have always asked a multitude of questions. How can we understand the world in which we find ourselves? How does the universe behave? What is the nature of reality? Where did we come from? Did the universe need a creator? Next paragraph. Traditionally, these questions, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. This is the opening salvo of Stephen Hawking's new argument. Now, what I want to submit to you, and then it's through anecdotes that actually wind up just further giving reason to the cause, is that philosophy has a PR problem. It's a big PR problem. Right? And it's not the sort of PR problem that we can be self-satisfied in our sort of temple of ideas and say, well, they're wrong and we're right. Because it's affecting the way that we do philosophy. Right? It's not only affecting the way that philosophers are perceived by their peers, right, within academic institutions, but it's actually affecting the manner in which we do philosophy. And it's not for no reason. It partially has to do with the manner in which we do philosophy. Right? Now, just to further this with a couple of quick anecdotes. Right? I'm a seminar leader, and I've actually jump boat into an interdisciplinary program right now, which my project is housed in the political science department. Luckily, I wind up assisting with essentially a political philosophy class. It's political ideologies. And on the first day of class, the professor asked the class, what's the distinction between political theory and political philosophy? The students don't know what the word philosophy means, but they have this overwhelming sense that philosophy is less practical. Based on what? But that's the sense of things, right? Now, not too long ago, last year, I did a guest lecture for the Ways of Knowing class at the University of Windsor. Right? Justin Langlois was actually teaching it as Ways of Knowing Your City. And I got up there and I gave a little talk about my research, and then I gave a little talk about the Windsor Philosophical Association and public philosophy events. And the students were stymied. This is a philosopher who does something. This isn't one of the competitors in the soccer game wandering around going, not even looking at the ball, not even moving the ball, not even engaging in the game. Right? Why are people astounded by this? Well, this is the drawback. I actually have notes. So I would argue that the public perception of philosophy emerges from both a misunderstanding of the role of philosophy, that is, what we do, right, and reveals a problem with the discipline, with how we do it. Right? Now, ancient Greek philosophy was science. Right? It related to questions of about how we ought to live and what a good and fully human life was. Right? It was science. We move to medieval philosophy. We find that either that philosophy was theology or heresy. Right? I like to call it philosophy at the point of the sword. Now, in terms of the Enlightenment, right, philosophy reasserts itself as science against the theological myth, but in doing so, it draws a hard distinction between science and myth, and I'm borrowing a lot from Horkheimer to go out there. Right? Modern philosophy, having driven out the sort of cultural content of myth, attempts to ground itself as a rigorous science. But problematically, the sciences have already established themselves methodologically, and attempting to ground philosophy in this manner turns the philosopher ultimately into a scientist. Right? So we wind up in this modern context, right, either abandoning philosophy for other forms of theory, or turning philosophy into a form of science under the heading of the methodology. Right? Now, today, most philosophers either emulate scientists in their methods and subjects of inquiry, or they link themselves, they think of themselves as argument technicians, turning philosophy inward and isolating it from its content. Right? Now, I want to argue that this has to do with how philosophy gets done. Right? The public perception of philosophy and, in fact, the funding structures that are present for the philosopher in the contemporary academic world have a lot to do with forcing a philosopher to justify themselves in this manner. What does philosophy do? Well, we're argument technicians. What does philosophy do? Well, I don't know what those guys over there are doing, but I'm working with this brain scan machine. So, we should ask ourselves where, in fact, philosophy winds up getting done, in what context, right? And first, we find philosophy gets done at the university, right? In classrooms, and in the case of professional philosophers, in their offices, largely with the doors shut. Right? Philosophy gets done at conferences, populated almost exclusively by other philosophers. That is, we talk to ourselves with is the greatest of science. We do philosophy in journals and books, which is a wonderful way to disseminate knowledge. But these journals and books are subject to the publish or perish academic model. Interestingly, almost nobody reads a number of these journals. I'm not universalizing it. There are some very big journals out there in which some very interesting arguments get done. But the very specialized journals, which populate the majority of the field, nobody reads them. You've got a journal, 12 people read it. They were all on a bus. That bus crashed. Nobody would read the journal. And then philosophy gets done when? Late at night, usually while drinking. People wind up reflecting in usually unfocused manners about what the good life would be and what's really meaningful, etc., etc. Right? And then finally, where does philosophy get done? On our deathbeds, where philosophical questions are finally unavoidable. Right? So overall, right, if we look at where philosophy gets done, at the university, in their offices, or in the closed context of a classroom, at conferences between philosopher and philosopher closed to the public, journals and books that the non-specialist would never touch with a 10-foot pole, late at night while drinking, usually a private affair, and then finally, right, the most loneliest of lonely moments, right, on our deathbeds. It's a private affair. Right? So overall philosophy, as it gets done in contemporary society, is private. Right? Except for in an institutional setting. Or a philosopher, as it's studied and practiced in these settings, becomes navel-gazing, divorced from actual action in the world or in our lives. Right? Now, I'm just anticipating your counter-arguments here. Right? The last time I presented this, I had a number of very good ones. Right? Where else would philosophy get done? In practice, you would think. Right? Most of my courses that I teach are ethics courses, and they're ethics courses for nurses. So I would hope that a lot of the ethics that I get done, that I teach, actually gets put into practice in emergency rooms, in chronic care, and that sort of thing. Right? So you would hope that philosophy, as it actually gets done, disseminates itself everywhere. Right? But we don't call it philosophy, and the public perception of philosophy doesn't benefit from it at all. We call it just being a decent human being. Right? Thinking about what the heck you're doing in a critical and moral manner. Right? Philosophy doesn't get the credit for that. Right? And we remain in a situation where we have this public perception as bullshitters and do-nothing philosophers. People are astounded when we actually do something. And finally, and I think worst of all, as a historical curiosity, it's something that history departments and classic departments talk about. Well, it's very interesting to talk about Plato is in the context of Greek culture. Right? Well, I'm really dissatisfied with that. I'm really dissatisfied with that position within philosophy because I think we've got more to offer in the context of culture. All right? So, largely at this point, all right, I have more to say here, but I'm going to put it aside. I you know, basically I want to highlight what the Windsor Philosophical Association does. Why are we downtown rather than in Rome at the university? Right? Because, I mean, if we think of the starting point of philosophy, where did Socrates philosophize? In a room with the door locked? Right? Did he write his buddies? And did it happen in private lectures? Or in private notes? No, of course not. He was in the middle of the busiest, most social place in his city-state. And that's where Socrates saw the most value to philosophy. Now, amazingly, I'm going to jump straight from Socrates to Nietzsche. The only other quotation that I'll actually offer. And his Beyond Good and Evil, these aren't new arguments, right? These aren't new concerns with the role of philosophy, right? Nietzsche, in Beyond Good and Evil, winds up arguing that a new category of philosophers is on the rise. Shall I be so bold as to christen them with a name that's not without dangers? As I divine them, as they allow themselves to be defined, for part of their nature is to want to remain a riddle in some respects, these philosophers of the future might rightfully, and perhaps also wrongfully, be described as experimenters. And this name, too, is ultimately only an experiment, and if you would like, a temptation. Now, while there's debate about what this new category of philosophers might look like, I take this passage from Nietzsche to be a challenge to reinvent both the role and the nature of philosophical practice. Nietzsche notes that this new category of philosophers will not be dogmatists. Right? And that's a caution I take seriously. So, experimentation. Right? That might be a wonderful role for a public philosopher to take up. Okay? Now, where do we find a model for public social experimentation? Myself, I take my cue from artist collectives. Artist collectives that put an intellectual, visual, and cultural package out into the world, allow it to evoke a reaction, allow it to come through to its conclusions, and in a public manner be critically evaluated. Applied lived thought experiments, like the argument boxing match. Why not? Right? I mean, as ridiculous as an idea it is, right? These are the ideas that we have as philosophers late night while drinking, and we say, we should totally do that. We should totally do that. And then it never gets done. Why don't we do that? Right? What it'll do is a number of things. Right? Visual arts is a great example insofar as it's somewhat academicized. And then works. Right? It's heavily intellectual, yet it has a public interface.
So VR and not the same PR problem.
It has a reception. Right? It attempts to speak to an audience. Right? Now, if philosophers could perhaps manifest, right, what this lively world of ideas that we engage with, right, and we love, this is a love profession, right, and demonstrate in some sort of public manner, right, bring it out of the offices, bring it out of the classrooms, bring it out of academia into a public forum, then perhaps these public misconceptions of philosophy can at least be addressed. Right? I know in our intro to philosophy classes, with a captive audience and a power dynamic that is decisively in our favor, right, we're able to convince a number of people that philosophy might not be, as the unemployment officer in History of the World Part 1 claimed, bullshit. Right? In that context, we might be able to convince, I don't know, even as high as 40% of our class. At Oakland University, where I teach, we actually wind up tracking our conversions. Right? And I rate rather high. Right? It's a number of people converted from other disciplines to philosophers. I've always had mixed feelings about that.
I do the opposite.
Right? Oh. Okay.
You turn people off? Yes.
But ultimately, right, in that situation, it's the product of, 4 months, 3 hours a week of long power dynamic oriented persuasion. Why not talk to non-specialists? Why not present philosophy as it's interesting to us in a public way, right? In a manner that can get people excited about it. Right? So ultimately, this is why these events are not on campus. This is why these events are trying to be geared to a more generalized audience, right? Not just the specialists. Right? And that's why the WPA sponsors a public philosophy prize. This is an attempt at a form of cultural, why not just call it a bribery? Right? I'm bribing you, right? I'm encouraging you. And now I'm presenting a sort of an incomplete micro-argument for how you should. Right? It's vitally important to engage in public philosophy. Philosophy that winds up transcending the ivory tower. Right? That winds up transcending traditional disciplinary boundaries. Right? We're the discipline that doesn't mind its own business. Thank you. Now, next up, we have the recipient of the 4th Stan Cunningham Prize for Public Philosophy.
Good evening. Mind the rattling knees. The inspiration for this paper came from a late-night reading of one of my political science textbooks. I was making my way through the introductory chapter of the text, where I smiled at an all-too-familiar name. The authors cited Aristotle as the first person to look at politics as something separate from philosophy. This raised my eyebrow, as when I read Aristotle's Politics, it was definitely within a philosophical light. However, I could dismiss this with the fact that I've only read bits and parts of the work. The problem was that the text seemed to be incredibly proud with the separation of political science from philosophy. It was glad to be separate from philosophy's frivolous, normative ways. Political science should be just that, a science, something empirical. A handful of pages later, the text was mentioning a divide in the field. Apparently, they were unsure as whether or not they should be moving forward using a qualitative or a quantitative method. Ought, I thought? Isn't that a normative question? It seemed to me that the field that just pages ago was all too happy to be rid of philosophy was now suffering. Perhaps because they lacked the critical thinking tools provided by philosophy. My paper will be divided into 3 sections. Origins, in which I hope to show that there is a culture of specialization growing in the world. Sacrifice, in which I hope to show that this culture is detrimental to our society. And Answers, in which I hope to offer some possible solutions to the problem. Origins. When I look at the various departments at the University of Windsor, or for that matter, any university, I can't help but wonder how many of them draw their intellectual roots from Aristotle, the philosopher. Why is it then that so many of them seem to brag about being something apart from philosophy? Aside from political science, I can think of psychology and sociology that are so common known to make sure that there is a line drawn between them and philosophy, having only recently left its domain. Today's academic culture seems to have drawn a dichotomy between science, which is championed as objective and useful, against philosophy, which has been regarded as subjective and frivolous. As Martha Nussbaum points out in her book, Not for Profit, this divide is becoming more prominent, and many of the other humanities and arts are also being branded as useless. The culture of specialization seems to be a product of the 20th century, and is now perhaps giving a push here in the 21st. Capitalism encourages us to become competitive in a world where technology's power is growing and globalization is becoming more and more of a reality. Specialization in a technical science offers an apparent competitive edge. They are considered to have more utility, ultimately surpassing the broadly educated. This, of course, does seem to have hints of truth. A society of specialists can theoretically develop technology further than those built on a society of jacks of all trades. The recent economic crisis has compounded our worries about maintaining a competitive edge. Everyone wants to secure our economic future, and specialization seems to provide a way to do so. In not-for-profit, Nussbaum shows that liberal educations are being pushed away in favor of more specialized ones. Her focus is primarily aimed towards the arts and humanities, which of course includes philosophy. She notes a disturbing trend towards scientific and technological educations that altogether dismiss the humanities. There seems to be a sort of shame cast over a student who goes into the arts or humanities. Parents, out of worry for their beloved child's future, worry that philosophy will not secure employment in the fragile economy. I cannot count how many people have given me quizzical looks when I report that I am a student of philosophy. They immediately ask what I'll be able to use it for. And I want to coolly answer, everywhere, or life. But sadly, I'm just as affected by the culture as anyone else, and I list off my potential employment options. In contrast, an engineering or nursing student carries no such stigma. Their future careers are more or less baked right in with their academic subject. Their parents can rest easy knowing that engineers are needed to fill a growing employment field, or that nurses have security in the fact that there will always be a health industry. The arts and humanities, although the first victim of specialization, can be just as guilty as the sciences or trade educations. First note again my example from political science. Political science has long been considered a humanity, but it is obvious from their attempt to differ themselves from philosophy that they don't want to be labeled by association to our side of the dichotomy. The field of history also seems to have a will to be considered scientific. The University of Windsor, though admirable in its insistence on the importance of critical thinking, also seems to fall into the traps of specialization. In my first semester here, I was a liberal arts major. I'd hoped to educate myself as broadly as possible so that I could be helpful in many subjects in my future career as a librarian. However, I was soon disappointed. Firstly, an information and library studies degree requires an honors program first. UWindsor does not provide such a thing, does not supply an honors degree for liberal arts. So I switched to philosophy, as I believed it to be the next broadest program. Secondly, I noticed, and I still notice, that many departments have walled off their courses from non-majors. I cannot help but notice the grip of the specialist culture. English courses seem to be at least a bit resistant to breach into as non-major. Visual arts and drama, nearly impossible. Philosophy seems to be leaning also towards specialization. As previously alluded to, much of the academic world draws their roots in philosophy. Even the sciences are linked to a philosophical root. As is much noted, philosophy is the love of wisdom. Aristotle, like many of the ancient philosophers, thought broadly. They aimed to study everything about their world, from physics to biology to ethics. Today's philosophers, however, do not seem to reflect this past. We have certainly become specialized. our knowledge of the empirical sciences seems to be only peripheral to the work in logic, metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Several of my colleagues, myself included, have been guilty of uttering contempt for the applied sciences. Those darn engineers. It seems like we too have fallen into the belief that we are somehow disconnected from the other side of the academic coin. The culture of specialization seems to have given us all tunnel vision. Sacrifice. Why is this a problem? Is now the question of choice. As mentioned, specialization seems to allow society as a whole to delve deeper into academic areas and push further the limits of technology and growth. Our culture seems to be giving what they see as objective sciences more importance than the often branded subjective humanities. I shall defer to Nussbaum's arguments to show that that specialization towards technology, specialization in heavy degrees towards technology actually reduces its economic utility, and B, that specialization away from the humanities is detrimental to individuals and democracy itself. Common sense seems to dictate that a specialist would be able to do more for his or her field than someone who has chosen a broad education. And to a degree, this is correct. However, it gets to the point where the specialist is unable to innovate creatively around difficulties. Consider again the example from my textbook. Political scientists have been met with the normative challenge of determining whether or not they ought to take a qualitative or quantitative path. But they seem to lack the critical skill set required to deal with normative issues. Broad, more liberal educations with attention given to the humanities and arts give individuals the critical thinking skills and creativity that is required for problem solving. No amount of technical training can provide these abilities beyond the scope of basic troubleshooting. Nussbaum notes that the lords of industry are now beginning to recognize this. They are looking for executives that are able to think critically and creatively, but they are finding an ever-shrinking pool of people who are able to do this as the culture of specialization grips more of the world. In his often quoted speech to Stanford University graduates, Steve Jobs recalls how a largely considered useless calligraphy class that he took eventually led to the creation of rich fonts. This example seems to show that even in the highly technical field of computer science, liberal education has utility. The tool sets provided by philosophy and humanities are being lost in the wake of specialization. Nussbaum argues that the most important purpose of liberal education is not economic utility, but its role in developing strong, self-thinking individuals that create a democracy that can truly exist. The critical thinking skills nurtured by the humanities and philosophy are essential to creating individuals that question the world around them and their government. Nussbaum believes that submissive, complacent populations pave the way for injustices to occur. Citizens who can problem solve in a refined way need less direction and are greater assets to their world. The arts, she says, teaches humans how to see the world in new ways and assists in the development of our empathy. Empathic citizens are less likely to find themselves dividing into hostile groups and are more likely to extend care to each other. Those who are only technically trained do not have their critical thinking or empathy nurtured. And Nussbaum believes that this becomes a real detriment to a wise democracy. As people can be led to believe whatever the leaders tell them, and horrors can be enacted between groups. Academically, I worry that specialization makes us lose sight of the bigger picture in a way that actually hinders the study of our own respective fields. Philosophers that ignore science will always be disconnected from reality and lose hope of discovering any real truth. Artists that ignore science lose the chance to understand their audience's psychology and miss out on some of the most inspiring and beautiful things in the universe. For example, Biology and chemistry display some of the most remarkable structures I've ever seen, and are nothing if not inspirational. Scientists that lose sight of the humanities will at best be cursed with stale ideas and a lack of ability to discover challenging truth. The theory of relativity seems to be a good example. Einstein's idea was so contrary to the directions of thinking of his time that they could not see the truth of his proposition. Einstein's open-minded and non-traditional approach to science was cut from the very same cloth that the kinds of thinking that are nurtured by the humanities. Scientists that lose sight of the humanities at worst might commit horrors against their fellow person. A scientist who has been reared by the humanities would have the ability to empathize and defy authority. Therefore seems less likely to justify harsh means to reach scientific ends. Would empathic scientists be able to infect fellow humans with syphilis as they did in the Tuskegee experiments? My intuition would say no. Engineers without the arts would be doomed to creating uninspired structures and will fail to find innovative solutions to man's problems. Clearly, an academically holistic approach is necessary for progressing all of our respective fields. Answers. The solution to this problem is hard to find. How does one go about changing a dominant culture? While we cannot tell the families how to raise their children, our school systems can be changed to reflect the need for well-rounded education. At the primary and secondary levels, we have to stop cutting funding to the arts. Class size must be small enough for instructors to be able to engage with their students in a way that allows critical thinking skills to be assessed and nurtured. Critical thinking and creativity cannot be assessed by nationwide standardized testing. A hopeful trend is developing now where more and more introductions to philosophy classes seem to be available at the secondary level. Also, I think students just entering secondary school should not be expected to write down their entire life plan and choose a specialization. It's just asking too much. Education should not be specialized at this level at all. Rather, students should be encouraged to dip their toes in all the fields available to them. At the post-secondary level, both universities and colleges, I do see the need for some level of specialization. As previously mentioned, a degree of it is necessary and even preferred. However, undergraduate programs must be built to leave room for electives and to have students take course outside of their respective fields. In many respects, this is already true of universities. My program, like most others at UWindsor, has significant room for electives and has requirements in the sciences, languages, and general arts. Aside from perhaps lowering the shields against non-majors, many of our universities here in Canada and the US seem to have a liberal arts tradition that is still resisting specialist assimilation. Colleges, on the other hand, worry me. Most people I know who enter college report that they have precious little space for their electives, and their program is more or less mapped out from them from the start. It is in these situations that the humanities are ignored at the peril of society. Colleges must resist the urge to focus solely on ensuring post-education employment and look towards developing independent, well-rounded citizens of democracy. At all levels, I think that, and I got this from Nussbaum, that there has to be a sort of Socratic method to our education systems. It encourages involvement and certainly encourages critical thinking skills to be nurtured. Maybe if these ideals are cultivated within our education system, our culture will again shift towards respecting liberal education and the arts and humanities. Hopefully this will in turn strengthen our democracies and raise the levels of wisdom and justice in our society as a whole. Maybe the political scientists of my textbook would be able to work past their normative issues. More importantly, I hope that people will stop giving me a funny look when I say, my major, I'm a philosophy student. Thank you.
We've got about 5 minutes for questions, if you like. Shall I moderate? Questions, comments?
I have a question. I have heard philosophers dismiss much of... Oh, thank you. I've heard philosophers dismiss much of Aristotle's political writings as simply empirical or simply descriptive or political science. Do you think that's an error too?
I can be.
When I read the Politics, again I say it was just bits and pieces. However, it seemed to me that it was a natural progression from his ethics to his politics, and there seemed to be a connection that was in every way philosophical. And admittedly, he's more empirical than most other Greeks.
Thanks.
So.
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
I don't need the microphone. Have you thought about, just something to think about, I don't know if it's a question or a comment, or something like philosophy as the interdisciplinary discipline, as that form of, maybe as it specializes in the future, you might be conceiving philosophy as the, rather than some kind of originary discipline, maybe it was, so we don't know, but maybe as it continues in the future, becoming something like the interdisciplinary discipline, and being open and taking things in from all the disciplines around and continuing to do what we do, but being with an explicit openness.
I think that's exactly what I'm hoping for. Is we've all seemed to have divided ourselves in the university apart from each other, and I think philosophy especially has the ability to broadly answer questions in all fields, and I think all the fields have something that could offer philosophy.
Here.
Thank you. Next up, we've got Michael Walshott, most recent graduate from the Master's Department, the Master's Program in Philosophy at the University of Windsor, and he will be giving his talk, The Changing Face of Philosophy.
So I have to be cliche and wear a scarf like a philosophy student or an art student, but I'm trying to hide the fact that apparently I'm wearing one of the philosophy uniforms. Grant and Carol and I seem to be wearing the same thing. So I'm happy to be here. Obviously, I just hope I can live up to the expectation of saying something interesting. So you'll have to let me know. Okay, so I'm gonna read. Unfortunately, I can't make a speech. So on a day like today, it's appropriate occasion to reflect on our discipline and what it is we spend our time doing. It's part of our enterprise to engage in sustained reflection on a variety of topics and issues that are, in other areas of life and expertise, taken for granted. Given we engage in reflection so often, is it inevitable that each of us will come to reflect upon what we do on a daily basis and examine what the nature of philosophy is and ought to be? In my paper, I'd like to offer some reflections on the nature of our discipline, and at least to partially address the question of what shape the discipline will take in the future. So after some initial remarks, I'd like to talk about how philosophers can change what I'm going to call the face of philosophy, which is actually somewhat similar to what Grant was talking about, the public perception of philosophy. And I'd also like to claim that by practicing what we preach, and by making an effort to make our work more accessible to non-philosophers, we can change not only the way philosophy is viewed in our culture, but we can have a more positive impact on culture at large. Among the numerous questions philosophers attempt to answer are ones such as, what is gender? What consists in living a good life? When does something count as science? Why should we feel obligated to obey the rules of the law? And when am I justified in claiming that I know something? The subject matter of philosophy has changed and evolved over the past 2,500 years or so, and it continues to alter its shape, even though we are asking some of the same questions, reading some of the same texts, and partially having some of the same discussions. There are more and more numerous questions that philosophers seem to be both interested in and specifically capable of attempting to answer, and this seems to be because the particular kind of critical reflection carried out in philosophy is valuable in a certain way. So Wilfrid Sellars once described the traditional goal of philosophy as the production of an articulated and integrated vision of humanity and its place in the universe. If this is philosophy's traditional goal, for what purpose is this done? Is the goal of philosophy simply to pursue truth or knowledge for its own sake, or is the idea that producing a conception of humanity and its place in the universe is good for a certain purpose? Aristotle claimed about his ethics that we are not conducting this inquiry in order to know what virtue is, but in order to become good. So there's a sense in which at least ancient philosophy thought of philosophical reflection as being, in a sense, intrinsically practical, or as being done for a practical purpose, that is, in order to become good or live better. And this is not limited to ethics. Aristotle claimed that true arguments in general stimulate those who understand them to live according to them. Now, it's arguably the case that not everything philosophers concern themselves with can be lived.
Can't you people listen for 5 minutes? Talk later.
Thanks,
No,
appreciate it.
no problem.
Appreciate that. I might have something interesting to say.
Yeah, like,
I mean,
just pay attention
maybe.
for fucking 5 minutes, people. Simple shit. I'm not even that drunk.
Awesome. Stick around.
Yeah.
Might get more interesting.
Could we get more drunk?
So, yes, yeah. Not everything philosophers concern themselves with can be lived. As Wayne Sumner puts it, I don't know what it might mean to live by a theory of causation or truth or intentionality, and neither do I. I do not wish to spend some time thinking about which kinds of positions are capable of, in principle, altering one's way of life, were they to be adopted, and which are not so capable. What I do think is worth thinking about, however, is whether or not philosophers themselves consider, one, if the theory they are proposing could in principle change the way they live their lives, and two, what it would look like for their lives to be lived according to the positions they argue for. While we may be unclear with respect to what it would look like to live one's life according to an epistemological or metaphysical position, this doesn't mean that living one's life according to such positions is impossible. It means that we haven't thought enough about how our philosophical commitments relate to the way we live our lives, or that we haven't worked out the practical implications of our abstract beliefs. Furthermore, it is arguable that theoretically working out the practical implications is only part of the job, and we won't know what it means to live a philosophy until it's lived, of course. But this aside, working out the practical implications of theoretical commitments has at least two consequences. The first is that it should, at least in principle, enable philosophers themselves to lead better lives and make better decisions. And the second is that it should enable philosophers to more easily communicate recommendations for decisions on matters of public importance to the members of society in general. I'd like to discuss these two things in turn. I'd like to suggest that philosophers practicing what they preach and making an effort to communicate their ideas to non-philosophers will both change the way philosophy is viewed in our culture for the better, and will help people live better lives as well. So to start with, philosophers practicing what they preach. So last June, University of Toronto philosophy professor Wayne Sumner gave his keynote presentation at the Canadian Philosophical Association on philosophical ethics and social responsibility. In this paper, he discussed how the study of ethics, which, as my quote from Aristotle suggests, is thought of as one of the more practical areas of philosophy. But that this sub-discipline does not necessarily make one a better person. He cites a few studies carried out that asked philosophers to compare the behavior of ethicists known to them with philosophers in other areas of specialization. 2/3 of ethicists and non-ethicists put together claim that ethicists do not behave better than other philosophers. Furthermore, 1/3 of non-ethicists claim that ethicists actually behave worse, meaning that ethicists who participated in the study rated their fellow ethicists more highly.